A 24-year-old British backpacker, wide-eyed and curious about the world, steps off the plane at an airport in Sydney, ready to begin his amazing adventure of endless sights and new experiences in the great southern land. It was the 25th of January, 1990, during the Australia Day long weekend, a public holiday that recognises the landing of the first fleet of European settlers in Australia. The backpacker was Paul Onions, a 24-year-old ex-Navy man from Birmingham, United Kingdom. His travels would take him to a small suburb in Sydney. He had planned to hitchhike south towards Mildura, a town in the southern state of Victoria. It was a hot summer's day, and Paul had stopped outside a convenience store to pick up some refreshments, when he was offered a ride by a man who Paul thought bore a striking resemblance to a famous cricketer. The man called himself Bill. Paul enthusiastically agreed and jumped in, and the two journeyed south. The ride was rather uneventful at first, but further on, the man known only as Bill began to make racist and xenophobic remarks. His demeanour and attitude began to change, and Paul began to suspect a sinister ulterior motive. Less than a kilometre away from the Belanglo State Forest, Bill stopped the car and pulled over to the side of the road. Paul tested the situation by pretending to stretch his legs. He got out of the car, and Bill urged him to get back in. Paul did so, and put on his seatbelt. Next thing he knew, the man had pulled out a revolver and pointed it straight at Paul. Paul acted quickly and escaped from the car. He ran along the road, hoping to stop a passing car for help. The cars would slow down, and then, realizing the danger of the situation, would drive off. The man was yelling at Paul to get back in the car. Paul saw one last car and jumped in the middle of the road. The car stopped, and Paul quickly jumped in, and they drove off, away from the attacker. Thinking it was a random robbery, Paul Onions wouldn't come to realize how close he came to becoming another murdered body in a string of other cases in that area for another 3 years. Paul Onions was the only survivor of one of Australia's worst serial killers, Ivan Robert Milat, the backpacker killer. The Belanglo State Forest is a planted forest of mainly pine and some native forestry in the Australian state of New South Wales, found in the Southern Highlands between Sydney and the Australian capital city of Canberra. The public have free access to the forest, and it is popular for recreational camping and trail bike riders. But in years gone by, the name Belanglo conjures up thoughts of horror in the Australian psyche, and it is now synonymous with a spate of killings known as the backpacker murders. These murders would later become the basis for the idea behind the 2005 Australian horror film Wolf Creek, in which 3 backpackers are travelling around Australia, and when their car breaks down, they are taken captive by the deadly and extremely xenophobic outback serial killer Mick Taylor, played by esteemed Australian actor John Jarratt. In the previous episode, part 1 of the real-life stories behind Wolf Creek, we explored the case of Peter Falconio, a missing British tourist who was travelling around Australia with his girlfriend Joanne Lees. They were attacked by a gunman who attempted to kidnap Joanne, who managed to escape, but Peter Falconio's body was never found. If you haven't seen that video, we'll provide the link in the description below. In this episode, we're going to be focusing more on the murderer rather than the murders themselves, and seeing if we can draw some comparisons between Ivan Milat and the villain of the Wolf Creek film series, Mick Taylor. Mick Taylor is a fictional character from the Wolf Creek film series, a creation of writer-director Greg McLean, who leaned on real-life cases like the backpacker murders and used Ivan Milat and Bradley John Murdoch as inspirations for the character. Little is revealed about Mick's history in the films. The only information we receive is from what one of the characters witnesses on a video camera playback, in which it is seen that Mick lures tourists back to his camp in an abandoned mine by disabling their vehicles and pretending to rescue them. Mick Taylor is appeared to live alone in the abandoned mine, save for his dogs. He is shown to be a very good rifleman and drives a blue 4-wheel drive utility truck that has been modified for hunting in the outback. His xenophobic attitude is played out when he reveals his true colours to his victims. His MO is shown to be following and targeting tourists and backpackers, disabling their engine so it appears that they are stranded, and makes his move to rescue the victims and tow their vehicle back to his camp, and then drugging his victims before he tortures and kills them. His preferred weapon of choice is his long hunting knife, but also uses a .303 caliber rifle. The character traits and personality of Mick Taylor come from Greg McLean's experience with a politically incorrect tour guide. McLean used the tour guide as a template for the character of Mick Taylor. McLean also stated in an interview that he wanted the Mick Taylor character to be the antithesis to the Crocodile Dundee character, a sort of shadow entity to the Australian outback man image. Later on, news reached the headlines about the backpacker murders and the Bradley Murdoch case, and Greg McLean wove aspects of those cases into the plot of the film. In contrast, we know a lot more about the perpetrator of the backpacker murders. Ivan Robert Milat was born on the 27th of December 1945, the fifth of 14 siblings born to migrant parents from Croatia. The family was noted as being insular and kept mostly to themselves. Ivan's father was a hard-working and strict disciplinarian. Both parents finding it difficult to manage the 14 children obviously led to some of the boys to go astray. Ivan was described as a good-looking, muscular boy who had a fascination for hunting and guns. From the age of 17, Milat was constantly in trouble with the law and subsequently charged numerous times with housebreaking, car thefts, and armed robberies. In 1971, Milat was put on trial for the alleged rape of two female hitchhikers who testified that he had been armed with a knife during the attacks. This was in the days before DNA testing, and he was acquitted of the charges when the prosecution failed to make a convincing case against him. 7 of the 10 Milat brothers had run-ins with the law, and the Milat family became well known to the police. Ivan Milat often bragged to his friends about his capacity for violence. In one instance, he described to an acquaintance how to turn a person into a head on a stick by stabbing them in the spine, a trait that seems to have been transferred to his fictional counterpart, Mick Taylor. He was an avid shooter and often hunted in the forest where the bodies of his victims were found. The backpacker murders began in December 1989. On the day before New Year's Eve, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, 2 backpackers from Melbourne, set off from Sydney towards Albury, near the border of New South Wales and Victoria, for an alternative lifestyle festival. They had planned to meet friends, but never arrived. When neither made contact with the family in the weeks following, their relatives filed a missing persons report. Police were not immediately concerned. The other 5 victims followed similar paths. Simone Schmidl, 21, from Germany, left Sydney for Melbourne on the 20th of January 1991. She had been due to meet her mother at a Melbourne airport 4 days later. Gabor Neugebauer, 21, and Anja Hubschied, 20, also German, left Sydney on Boxing Day 1991. The couple was supposed to be making the 4,000-kilometre trek to Darwin before returning to Munich a month later. They never got on the plane. Caroline Clark, 21, from Surrey, England, and Joanne Walters, 22, from Wales, met at a backpackers hostel in Sydney's King Cross district and shared a flat there. They had hitchhiked a number of times together in Australia. In April 1992, they left Sydney again, with vague plans that seemed to involve heading south towards Victoria or to Perth in Western Australia. When weeks passed without any contact with their parents, the 2 families sprang into action, alerting police in the UK and Australia and using the media to drum up interest in the case. It didn't take long for journalists to start linking their disappearances with other cases. But it wasn't until September 1992 when 2 runners discovered the first bodies, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. Only then did the severity of the disappearances begin to emerge. Police found that Walters had been stabbed 21 times in the back, including 1 wound in her spine, believing it was to paralyze her while the killer continued to stab her chest a further 14 times. The zip of her jeans had been undone, but the button was still fastened, indicating sexual assault. Clark, as well as being stabbed repeatedly, had been shot in the head 10 times. 4 bullets remained in her skull, were preserved for forensic analysis, and detectives were confident that they would be able to use these to track the weapon responsible. A primitive brick fireplace had been constructed near the bodies, and cigarette butts and spent .22 caliber bullet cases were also recovered from the scene. The grisly discoveries didn't end there. A year later, in October 1993, a bushman collecting firewood found another body, the badly decomposed remains of James Gibson. After contacting police, they discovered Deborah Everest's body nearby. Post-mortem examinations again revealed paralyzing spinal knife wounds inflicted in a similar manner to the earlier British victims. Crime scene similarities included a small fireplace built near the bodies, making police more certain that they were dealing with the same killer. A massive search of the extended Belanglo Forest area was initiated and took almost a month before the next victim was found. November 1st, 1993, the remains of German national Simone Schmidl were discovered. Nearby the trademark fireplace and discarded .22 caliber shells were also found. There was no doubt she had fallen victim to the same killer, showing the now familiar spinal injury. The final two victims, Anja Habschied and her boyfriend, Gabor Neugebauer, were found 3 days later. The boy's jeans had been unzipped with the button unfastened, and he'd been strangled as well as shot numerous times. The girl's body was missing its skull completely, appeared to be severed off by a machete. After an intensive investigation, police narrowed down the list of suspects to a few dozen. Various independent reports had led investigators to develop suspicions about the Milat family, and in particular, Ivan Milat. A total of 7 bodies found and a serial killer on the loose gave way to the media, both nationally and internationally, to sensationalize the horrific stories. And it was half a world away, in Birmingham. British newspapers were reporting on the disappearances of the 2 British backpackers in the Belanglo State Forest. Paul Onions, the British backpacker from earlier, read this story and was convinced that they were related to his attacker. He made contact with Australian authorities in April 1994 with information about his 1990 attack. His account further corroborated by an independent call from the woman who rescued Onions and driven him to the police station. Paul was flown out to Australia, where he identified Milat from a video lineup, giving police the excuse they needed for the warrant to search the various Milat properties. In the early hours of May 22, 1994, a raid was carried out at Ivan Milat's residence, which revealed a huge amount of evidence linking Milat to the crimes. This included personal effects of many of the victims, including clothing, sleeping bags, and other camping equipment. Also, police found vast quantities of ammunition and disassembled weapons, including that of a .22 caliber rifle and a long cavalry sword, possibly used to behead Anja Habschied. Ivan Milat was arrested and taken into custody for questioning, where he was evasive and uncooperative. It wasn't until March 1996, in the full glare of international publicity, that Ivan Milat was charged with the 7 murders as well as the attack on Paul Onions. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. On July the 27th, 1996, following a 15-week trial, the jury returned after 3 days of consideration, finding Milat guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for the attack on Paul Onions, and 7 consecutive life sentences for each of the murders. Over the years, other disappearances in the Belanglo area have thought to be linked to Ivan Milat, but due to lack of evidence, nothing has been confirmed. Ivan Robert Milat, one of Australia's worst serial killers, was diagnosed with terminal esophageal cancer on May 13, 2019. He died 5 months later. The nightmare is now over, but the horror lives on in the minds of the Australian public. It's easy to draw comparisons between Ivan Milat and the fictional character Mick Taylor, given the details of the horrific crimes. Both used a rifle, had a xenophobic outlook, and were both sadistic in nature. They even employed similar torture methods upon their victims. What other comparisons have been made aware to you? Let us know in the comments below. This has been an episode of Shadow Matter, and this was part 2 of the real-life stories behind the Australian horror film Wolf Creek. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to see more content like this. Also, don't forget to check that notifications bell. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the Shadow Matter.